My name is Dr. Kate Balestrieri. I am a licensed clinical and forensic psychologist, a certified sex therapist, and the founder of a group practice called Modern Intimacy.
Incredible. You wear many hats from what you just said. Out of all of those hats, what would you say is your biggest focus?
I'm pretty divided equally in terms of my clinical focus with folks around helping them heal and helping them curate a relationship with sex that feels really empowered and enlivened. And then also the entrepreneurial and supervision aspects of owning a group practice and holding space for some of the non-clinical and more business or educational aspects of that piece. So it's a pretty even split right now.
I interviewed the woman who started Sex Coach University,
Okay.
and she said that part of the reason she started that was because she saw this need for professionals like doctors, psychologists, and therapists, and OBGYNs even to understand how to really talk about sex with people and how to really help their patients because for them, maybe it felt a little bit awkward. Or she said, there's just minimal schooling in that area when you're in school. Was that your case?
Absolutely. I concur with that 100%. For me, growing up, there was a lot of cloaked conversations about sex, and I was always very curious about why it was such a secret. And when I went to school and got my doctorate in clinical psychology, I was pretty blown away at the absence of education around human sexuality. And I didn't understand at the time why there was such an oversight, because I personally have always been very comfortable talking about sex and sexuality and have been very curious about why it holds such a charged place in our culture and in our lives. So it was a pretty natural progression for me to seek out certification as a sex therapist, because as a therapist and a psychologist and therapist who did a lot of teaching, I taught at the graduate level for over 10 years. And I noticed that a lot of students had such a difficult time talking about sex, and they even felt very squeamish being asked questions about it or being asked to reflect about their own relationship with sex and sexuality. Money carries a similar charge, interestingly. So these two topics for me, I don't really have a lot of difficulty talking about them. And I think most of the folks who find themselves in the role of a sex therapist have also been in that role for the people in their lives or in their therapeutic trajectory. So it to me, there's tons of education that we do not get as humans in Western culture. And one of the core ethos of my work and of my practice is around empowering folks with education relevant to sex and sexuality and dispelling a lot of the myths that we inherit along the way.
Yeah, that's incredible. It's interesting that you mentioned that sex and money kind of carry this taboo charge where people are very uncomfortable to talk about either. And that's really true. Um,
Mhm.
I'm curious, why do you think that is?
A couple of reasons, and this is a really short answer that we don't have a lot of time to go into the depth, but I'll say systemically, um, our sexual identity and our sexual virility are ways in which our identities and our sense of worth and social currency are often defined. And so is our capacity to earn money and our actual wallet and the size of our bank accounts. So when we talk about the ways in which our culture assigns power and worth to certain people or certain groups of people, then of course it becomes very taboo to talk about that for multiple reasons. One, it illuminates that overcoupling of financial power and worth. And it also starts to get people thinking about it. The more we think about it, the more we will organize against it as a way to define our ability to function in the world. So I think that it's taboo because keeping it quiet allows those hierarchies of power to remain in place.
Very interesting and well said. Yeah. Yes, I'm sure. Yes, I'm very sure that that is a topic that has very many layers that we could really go down.
Yeah. An overarching theme throughout my entire career has been the exploration of sexuality and how it relates to our mental health, our overall well-being, and the quality of our relationships. When I first got into this field, I was specifically working in correctional settings, doing evaluations, treatment, and expert witness testimony for folks who had been convicted of sexual offending charges. So I did a lot of work with that population. And as my career continued, my branch out into forensic work still included some focus around sexuality, specifically around sexual violence, but also expanded to include things like parenting capacity evaluations, custody evaluations, and some mediation and alternative dispute resolution kinds of work. From there, I transitioned more into private practice, and I have been doing less forensic work because the demands of owning a practice are pretty intense. So it's hard to find as much time to write those evaluations. But yes, I still do a lot of work focused around sexuality and how it finds a home and a space in our day-to-day psyches and our day-to-day lives.
You're the perfect person to ask this next question to, which it's something I truly wonder a lot, which is, as we all know, our sexuality is such a primal, foundational part of who we are as human beings. I think we all know that, but we don't really live that way. Like, we don't actually have that core understanding of what it is, what it means to have a healthy relationship with our sexuality, and how it impacts our mental health and our overall health in other areas. So I want to ask you, if someone isn't given a place where they feel safe enough or like they have the permission to explore their sexuality,
Mhm.
are there consequences for that?
Many people will go their entire lives with a really compartmentalized experience of sexuality. And what I mean by that is they may have a lot of shame around sex, or the kinds of fantasies and the kind of sexual experiences that they like may feel incompatible with how they see themselves as human beings. And that incongruence can leave a lot of folks feeling like sex is something they have to do in private, in sort of a metaphorical dark space, because to accept it into their being would mean something about how they see themselves or how other people might see them. That is in large part because of the incredible sex negativity that remains in our culture and that we are seeing right now in 2023 doubling down, right? We're seeing a very bifurcated experience of sex positivity and sex negativity, and the extremes in those polarities are really showcased because when we have new levels of consciousness as a collective, first we have to have a lot of tension that results in that consciousness. So there are many people who will have a relationship with sex that they sort of tap into over here in like the sidelines of their lives, and they may be okay with that, and they may feel a yearning for something more and not know what that means or how to fully appreciate the integration of sex into their full persona. But there are many people who don't have the limitations of sex negativity on their relationship with their own desire and arousal and practice of sex. And when that happens, they're able to invite the experience of sexuality holistically into their personhood. And in my opinion, those people have a much fuller experience of who they are, and they're able to approach intimacy within themselves. I don't just mean sexual intimacy, I mean emotional intimacy too, within themselves and with partners or their partner if they're monogamous, just with a more robust and meaningful level of depth.
You said something that I know is true, and I really like how you put it, which is that right now we're basically kind of at ahead with tension when it comes to sex positivity and sex negativity, but that's a necessary tension in order to basically transcend it, if I'm understanding correctly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you would say that what's happening in our current climate, which is, yeah, I mean, people are extremely divided right now, especially in regards to topics that are connected to sexuality. You would say that this is part of the process of moving in a more positive direction.
I would absolutely say that. And what that means to me is, well, there are multiple meanings that I attach to this. One, when we look at the system of how any community works, you're going to have groups within each system that activate certain roles and play out certain unconscious attitudes within the group. So when we have polarities of any sort, it's because the group is storming and kind of reorganizing and hasn't reached a new homeostasis. So right before we reach a homeostasis, there has to be a big eruption of the status quo. And that's what we're seeing right now. And part and parcel to that is this relationship with pleasure as a political strategy. And we do see a lot of tension politically around some of the conversation around sex, pregnancy, gender, sexual orientation. All of these conversations right now are a quote unquote easy space to other people. And when we create an other, we also create a false sense of comfort within a main group. And when we look at the motivations of human beings, we want to belong and we want resources. So when there is an us versus them, there's a fantasy that if I belong in the us group, I will have more belonging and more resources available to me. Now, sometimes that's true, of course, and sometimes it's a big fat fantasy. And right now, it's a big fat fantasy because the policing of these things like pleasure, I'll sort of reduce it down to that, is really a way to ensure that everybody continues to work really hard to move ahead this system of capitalism and power and money and all of the things at the expense of themselves. If we really believed pleasure to be a human right, nobody would be working as hard as they're working because pleasure would be available without having to prove it and earn it in this habitual and repetitive way all the time.
What you just said was so beautiful and enlightened. No, really, I felt like I could cry. I'm not even kidding. I almost could cry when you were talking because I actually was just having an interview the other day, and the expert I was talking to was saying there seems to be this particular discomfort with pleasure. And I asked them why they thought that was. And they didn't, I don't think they really knew why it was, but they had the evidence. And we can all see that evidence, if you take a vacation that's too long, a nap that's too long, we see it here at LiveJasmin where we're from. A lot of our models have really taken control of their sexuality, their pleasure, and their job is to help other people have pleasure and and know themselves sexually. And there is so much stigma and so much judgment and like a harshness from society that they face. And so, I mean, that's one glaring example, but there are many where you're right. We seem to be very uncomfortable with people having pleasure. And there is this idea of, did I earn this pleasure? Do you have to earn the pleasure? Or, like you said, is it a basic human right?
Mm-hmm. And it brings up another question about who does deserve pleasure, right? And I think that's a part of that social currency. If I have money, then I have earned my pleasure. If I have certain identities that I can wear and membership in certain groups, then I'm more deserving of pleasure. I'm not saying that that's good or the way we should think, but that is the way our hierarchical society has been organized. So when people do step into this place of, I deserve pleasure because I exist, that can really upend a system that demands we prove ourselves and work really hard. And that trajectory is a big farce for a lot of people, especially in our current economy, where lots of folks are working really hard and they do not have the ability to take a break and enjoy life. And that is one of the ways that we police pleasure, both sexually and non-sexually.
Wow, so well said. Why is there such a stigma when it comes to sexuality? Is that because maybe that's where we're getting one of the highest amounts of pleasure? Or what are your thoughts on that?
It's such a good question, and I'm going to try and do it justice because it is a really complex answer. Sexuality is so heavily scrutinized for a few reasons. We can start just by thinking a little bit about the nature of what sex is, and sex requires really close proximity if you're with a partner in real time. And that can bring up a lot of sensory activation. And if we kind of boil it down, sex can be kind of gross. You know, there's smells, there's sounds, there's all kinds of things that our skin to skin contact creates. So for some folks, there can be a bit of like a disgust response or a bit of an aversion if they don't feel enough desire around whatever the kind of sexual experience is. Disgust serves as a gatekeeping emotion. It lets us know what feels okay and what doesn't to enter into our physiological space, our bodies, or our concept of self. So I say all of that to say the next part, really, which is that sex socially has become so taboo, again, as a reinforcing element of certain power hierarchies. If everyone felt permission to be sexual in the ways that were interesting to them, first of all, in my opinion, I think we would see a lot of kinks kind of expand and then retreat. They wouldn't be as interesting without the taboo of them. So there's that piece. But part of what has happened in our culture over centuries is that sex has become something that is a commodity given to the people who work hard, i.e., men, and in America, primarily white cisgender men. So sex has been something that comes with this idea of having a partner and a house and a marriage and your children. And when we couple that with the religious motivations to maintain these patriarchal hierarchies, then sex starts to become this taboo for everyone. And of course, men have been permitted to have extra relational sexual experiences without a tremendous risk of ruining their entire lives or their careers. But women have been the group of people most controlled over centuries of policing pleasure. And through lots of direct and indirect conditioning about women's pleasure only being acceptable within the context of a married relationship or for the purpose of reproduction, anything that women have done over time to expand their catch of pleasure, their cachet of pleasure, has been looked upon as women stepping out of these roles that they were prescribed to. And so when we look at the ways that everyone now is sort of socialized around what is socially and sexually acceptable, a lot of it has to do with women who do get into sex work being seen as these really deviant kinds of women. I don't like that word, but that is a word that many sex workers will feel gets put on them all the time. Would you agree?
I would say that that's probably one of the nicer words. Yeah. There's way worse. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's a good amount of research that talks about the sexual harassment of uppity women. And an uppity woman, in quotes, is anyone who steps outside of this very traditional patriarchal role of a stay-at-home parent, a wife, and a mother. And so there's a reason that women who adopt that role tend to feel desexualized in society and in their relationships because they've removed sexuality from a part of what constitutes respectability in women. And so when women choose to go in a different route, whether that is being a mom who's very sexual and okay in her sexuality, or working in sex work, or being a woman who appreciates having sex with different partners, they're often seen as people who have stepped out and who have deviated from these scripts. And so women have been the dog that gets kicked throughout society. And any man who kind of chooses to engage with them can sometimes wear the quote contaminating effect of the disgust that we attach to certain groups of people. And so does that make sense, that whole path that I took from disgust?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm even just thinking about, other areas where you could potentially be stepping off script. And as a woman, not even just when it comes to sexuality, there are other areas where it's like, well, I have to really decide, is it worth it for me to step off here? Because for whatever reason, to step off would be honoring myself. That's how I feel. But I know that most likely there are going to be consequences for this because it's not on script, so to speak. And that could be anything from speaking up about things or, really valuing yourself in a certain role or position or whatever the case is. That's not really the traditional way that women are supposed to be doing things. That there could be consequences. The question would be, do you feel like, which I know you said this polarization and this tension that's happening is actually ultimately going to lead us into a more aligned place with each other, hopefully?
I really hope so. I do think that it's possible. And I think a lot of people have to get very angry and get very active in our political system to evoke change. And right now, because we have social media that allows us to talk to each other all across the world and across the country in real time, I do think that there are a lot of folks who are feeling more galvanized to take political action and to advocate differently so that we can have the freedoms that we need in place so that the people who want to practice a more traditional life can do that. But the rest of us who don't can also live our lives and we can live with more harmony. I do think that we're poised to see that change, and until it happens, there will be a lot of discomfort in the tension. But I think that the tension means that we're getting closer to some sort of place where there's a little bit more tolerance and a little bit more peace.
I completely agree with you. I really do like that analogy. And it's kind of like when you get sick and you're having symptoms, the virus or whatever it was actually already in you. But by being sick, you're actually releasing it. But now it's obvious and you're going through the symptoms. And now you feel like it's a problem, but that virus had been there. but it's
Mhm.
leaving now, but you have to experience the symptoms. I almost see what's happening in different areas like that, where actually these tensions were always there. These issues were always there, but now we're upheaving them, so to speak. And we have to go through the motions. And so we're seeing a lot of things that have always been here, but they were just more maintained and under the surface. And now they're above the surface and we have to clean it up.
Absolutely. I love that analogy. It's so spot on.
Yeah, thank you.
The thing is, when women are empowered in their sexuality and when women are empowered financially, the power dynamics change in our culture and in our community. And I think that is necessary and a really positive thing. We've not always lived in a patriarchy. These heteronormative and heteropatriarchal scripts that constitute the quote unquote traditional gender role ideation have not always been the case. They were invented, and they were invented with the purpose of controlling a society and producing a high yield capitalist society. So now that we are seeing the fruits of capitalism, but also the pitfalls of it, I think we are seeing a system shift, and that does include the empowerment of women sexually, financially, and otherwise. In fact, I was reading something the other day that was talking about how the United States has a score of 76.3% when we look at gender equity, but politically only 30, I think it was 39%. Don't quote me on that stat specifically, but somewhere in the 30s. Meaning that there is not a ton of parity or equality when it comes to women's political power. And this study did not look at non-binary folks, unfortunately. It looked at a binary. So that's the language I'm using here. But I do think that as women continue to have more spending power and more educational success and more professional success, they're going to have more political power, and we will see a rise toward a more egalitarian society, which is beneficial for everyone, not just women or people who are in other minoritized groups.
So true. It's so true that the power starts to shift. You know, one of my favorite stories, there was a war between tribes, and the women got together and they said, listen, no one is sleeping with their husband or any man until the war stops. And the war ended very quickly. You know what I mean? Like,
When we have equality politically and when we have mutual respect between all groups of all gendered people and all different racial backgrounds and ability backgrounds, like when we start to have parity that extends intersectionally, we will start to see a tremendous amount of pleasure that is realized for people everywhere, of every background. And the thing that's really frustrating for me in this sort of extinction burst, an extinction burst is when we see an upsurge of behavior before the behavior extinguishes completely. And I think that's what we're seeing right now when we're seeing this rise in misogyny, rise in racism, rise in ableism, all of these upticks of this behavior, of the symptoms that you described in your analogy. It's like a death rattle, right? Before they extinguish and dissipate. So it's going to get a little bit worse before it gets better. But there is a movement toward a more liberated experience of sexuality and knowledge about our bodies and destigmatizing sex. I mean, sex is literally just an activity
okay.
to do, right?
And what is our sexuality? How would you define that?
Sexuality is a core part of ourselves, excuse me, and a core part of our identity. And how I conceptualize it is that it is, of course, in part defined by the kinds of sexual behaviors and activities that we like and find pleasure in, but it also is more about an embodiment of our vitality, an embodiment of creativity and expression. It's a way that we play and explore. And so in that, there's a lot of energy and effervescence. And if there is a reproductive element that comes from it, it's not the only reason to be sexual, of course, but that can also be a physical expression of our creativity and generativity into this new human life. But for a lot of folks, it's about creating an expression of intimacy and a connection with another human, not to be confused with a commitment. You can have a very connected sexual experience that is casual. So it's about what are we creating together, and that energy feeds back into the other aspects of our identity and can help us learn about ourselves and our relationship with power, for example, or our relationship with different feelings. So it's, in my opinion, a source of ongoing education about who we are at a given time in our lives.
I'm curious, in your experience and your practice, are there any recurrent blocks or issues or themes that you see in your patients that are preventing them from having a sexually healthy life and fulfilling life?
Absolutely. The two words that come to mind immediately are permission and shame. So a lot of folks have been really cloaked in sex negativity and different layers of it. And they haven't yet found the permission within themselves to explore bringing sexuality or a kind of sexual play into their lives without feeling a tremendous amount of shame or compartmentalization. So one of the things that we start with often in sex therapy is really working to destigmatize and to mitigate shame so that folks can give themselves permission to be curious, even if they don't want to engage in a specific kind of sexual activity in real life, but they have it in their fantasies. What might that offer them? And when people start to realize that our fantasies can tell us a little bit about what we might want or need in life, but they don't define our worth, then people start to have a more open and accepting relationship with their own arousal, their own desires, and their sexuality.
Very interesting. So, from your perspective, you would say exploring fantasy is something that you think is important for people to have a healthy sexuality.
Absolutely.
Let's say there's someone who's like, you know what? I'm so confused. I thought that sexuality was between a husband and wife, and now everything is changing, and I don't even know what I like. Some people haven't even had that opportunity to explore themselves. Where would you tell them to start?
Such a great question. I think it's important to start by kind of just like tapping into yourself first and thinking about what do you want to experience, either in terms of physical sensations or in terms of emotions, and then exploring what kinds of fantasies might bring those experiences to life for you, whether they stay in fantasy or you enact them on your own or with a partner or through some virtual play, like with a cam model, for example. um, really getting curious about, what does the fantasy mean to you? Why is it important? What might it allow you to express in yourself that you don't feel access to in your day-to-day life, I think is important. But a great place to kind of get curious, if you don't even have the answer to those questions yet, is to start exploring different kinds of ethically produced erotic material, looking at different kinds of videos online that are, again, ethically produced, and talking to people about it who are open to talking about it with you, and getting curious about what other people explore. For folks who are curious about kink or BDSM, they might locally go to a munch and start talking with other folks who do play in that kink space to ask questions and get questions answered from people who are not going to be judgmental.
Sometimes I wonder if the members are going, they think they're going for one reason, but maybe there are underlying deeper reasons, which we know is true because there's free sexual content online. So when you're paying by the minute to spend time with someone, we know for sure that there's some type of connection you're looking for. But sometimes I also wonder, like, are people just needing an open, safe place where they know you can come here and you're allowed to talk about sex? You have full permission to even just talk about these topics, whereas there's not really those designated places in most people's day-to-day lives.
I agree. Yeah, I do think that people turn to live interactions with cam models, with OnlyFans models, with whomever might be available in that space because they are looking for intimacy in many cases, and the intimacy that is procured here feels safer because it is not always real, right? It's not real in real life. You don't have the same demands of an intimate partner in a relationship where you're doing life together. So it's a safer place in many ways for folks to avoid feeling rejected, for them to not have to worry about feeling judged where the stakes matter, right, with their primary partner if they have one. But I think you're absolutely right. And in that, we don't have a lot of open dialogue about sex in this country, for as much as sex is everywhere and it's all over every medium and every form of media. We still have such a taboo around talking about it openly. So I do think a lot of folks turn to the kinds of services that Jasmin offers because it is a place where they can land and explore and not have to worry about whether or not someone's going to be giving them feedback that interrupts their education in the experience. Maybe it's just a space for them. I think a lot of folks turn to porn or camming services because it's like the only place where they get to let their hair down, metaphorically, of course, and they don't have a lot of other responsibilities, including having to worry so much about whether or not the person that they're engaging in this behavior with is going to get their needs met too.
What role does connection play in our sexuality and overall well-being?
Connection in our overall well-being is paramount. It's primarily what we live our lives for because humans are relational creatures, and in varying degrees we depend on belonging with others to feel safe in this world. It's a huge part of our identity. It's a huge part of our access to what allows us to survive. So it's connection is huge. Um, Connection and sexuality can be really important. It really depends on how you're defining the word connection in that context, because I don't define it to mean commitment. And I think a lot of folks do overcouple that. But a connection is, in my opinion, about feeling seen in the moment, feeling witnessed, feeling welcome, and sometimes feeling inspired or challenged in a constructive way. So I think that a lot of folks do turn to sex as a place to find those kinds of connections, and sometimes included in that is the expression of love and commitment, but not always.
Yeah, I actually think that is an important distinction for anyone to make, actually, because I think a lot of people get hurt because they associate connection with commitment. I have a lot of girlfriends who will feel very connected to someone, and it's like, okay, but so where's the commitment? We're committed. He's not doing anything else, right? Just these types of conversations. But no, actually, that's not necessarily the case. Like you said, it could be, but
Mhm.
it's not. Just because there's a connection, that is not automatically grounds for commitment. So I do think that's an important distinction. And I also think that's why sites like LiveJasmin are so successful and popular because there are these moments where the member is feeling seen or heard or accepted. And those little pockets of connection, real connection, like you said, it's primal.
Mm-hmm.
We don't really get a lot of that. I mean, if you're really lucky and you have a really great support system, either with friends, family, or a partner, then you might be perfectly fulfilled in connection. But I think in general, a lot of people, at least in different periods, are not getting their connection needs met.
Yeah, we are living through a tremendous loneliness epidemic right now. And I think connection is something that most people really crave in such an acute way, and also don't really know how to cultivate anymore because so many reasons that I won't necessarily go into. Yeah.
Would you say like technology could potentially be one of them, or do you think we're just losing the skill of understanding how to connect? I mean, I can say even sometimes if I'm on I love eye contact. So it's like I even notice that people are uncomfortable with eye contact, and maybe it's too connecting or whatever the case is. Without getting too deep to where you're comfortable, what would you say are some of just basic reasons why we're not as connected?
Sure. I think there are a handful of reasons. Definitely, technology plays a part in that. We have grown more accustomed to a two-dimensional kind of connection through social media and technology. For example, in this conversation, right, we can see each other, we can hear each other, but we don't have all of the biofeedback data that we would have about one another if we were in person. And things like our smells, even our imperceptible smells that unconsciously we're picking up on with each other, that gives us a lot of really important information about what's happening between the two of us. So I do think that technology is created for a lot of folks who don't also have a lot of in-person connection, an interesting kind of buffer that might make socializing in this two-dimensional way more accessible, but also in person can create then a bit of sensory overwhelm because they're used to creating intimate connections without that biodata, or that biological data, or that feedback with one another. So it can be a little overwhelming, which is why I do think we're seeing more folks regulating themselves by averting eye contact. That's one of the first ways that we learn how to regulate, or that we know how to regulate our bodies. But I also think we do live in a time where economically a lot of people are working really hard just to survive. And so in many ways, our bodies are in a bit of a chronic fight or flight, freeze or fawn state. And we don't necessarily have the capacity to be calm and connected with one another the ways that we would if we had some of these basic needs met and we felt more security in our lives.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's really important, a really important point. So that people can start looking at these areas of their life. I think that is really important to start saying, okay, what can I do to kind of alleviate some of this chronic fight or flight? How can I feel more secure so that I can have more meaningful relationships?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Really incredible points. I mean, I have really loved this conversation. I've really learned a lot. You've brought a different perspective, which is really incredible. If you could deliver one message to everyone in the world about human sexuality that you don't think the world is really getting right now, what would the message be?
The message would be that sexual liberation is the key to world peace. Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Because without the policing of sexuality, all of the other hierarchies that sustain our isms go away. in my opinion, that policing of sexuality, the policing of gender, the policing of pleasure is really about maintaining these power hierarchies, and they are not good for the long-term sustainability of our well-being and of our planet and of our communities. So when we treat women and minoritized groups with equality, and that includes sexual liberation, we have a more expansive understanding of acceptance. We have more room for collaboration, and there's less need for the jockeying of power. And when there's less need for the jockeying of power and the demonstration of power and the precariousness that comes with proving one's power and one's worth in those ways, then we all have access to pleasure and to peace and to the confidence that we will have the resources we need to live a life worth living.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very beautifully said. Thank you so much.
This was a really wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This has been a really great conversation.
It has, you ask amazing questions. Like, you are one of the more talented like interviewers that I have worked with. So thank you. Like, you pulled the answers out of me, and that's great.
Oh, thank you. That's always incredible to hear.